This is the most important election of our lifetimes, and we need the leadership of the Latino community, your voices and your votes. I hope you'll join me as we continue to build on the progress we've made.
Can Joe Biden convince Hispanic voters poised to become America's largest minority voting bloc to support him in November's presidential election? And the U.S. military budget has increased over $100 billion under the Trump administration. Will the pandemic lead to a cut in America's defense spending? Plus, with U.S. jails becoming hotspots for coronavirus outbreaks, we look at how America's prisons are a crisis within a crisis. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. Latinos are expected to make up 13% of voters in November's presidential election. That puts them, for the first time, ahead of African American voters. Now, with weak support among Latino voters, the Biden campaign is planning to launch a $55 million plan focusing on two battleground states with large Hispanic communities, Florida and Arizona. The Biden camp is also targeting key swing states that Trump won by narrow margins in 2016, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Now, despite Trump's anti-immigration policies, recent studies show that his support among Latino voters has increased since the last election. Today, 30% say they support the president. Trying to make up lost ground and capture enough Latino votes, Biden recently called the deportation of 3 million Hispanics during the Obama administration, quote, a big mistake. Can Biden overcome this challenge and earn the trust of America's rapidly growing Hispanic community? Let's go in depth with Evelyn Perez-Verdia, a Democratic strategist specializing in Latino issues in the state of Florida. Evelyn, there are now 32 million eligible Latino voters, so quite a force to be reckoned with. How crucial will they be to Joe Biden's chances of success in November?
They are very crucial, Ghida. Honestly, it's amazing because we have been talking for a very long time about the Latino vote and the Latino vote being that sleeping giant. And one thing we have seen from the election of Donald Trump in 2016 to 2018 midterm elections, the national trend on Google on November 3rd, 2018, nationally by 3,300% were the words "donde votar," which means where to vote in Spanish. So that gives us a clear light to the fact that the Latino community wants to vote, but we have to teach them how to vote and where to go to vote. And that's where Joe Biden comes in, and the campaign needs to come in and teach them how to do that.
But beyond teaching them, the Biden campaign knows that it's got quite an uphill battle, though, doesn't it? It's got that Obama legacy on immigration and deportation to shake off. Can Biden actually win over those reluctant Latino voters?
Well, you know what? I like to talk about the Biden legacy. And the Biden legacy of Vice President Joe Biden since he was 30 years old in the Senate is that he has always, all his career looked south. Many times we have presidents that look east and west, but we have a president that when he was vice president, he traveled 16 times to Latin America. How many times did President Trump travel to Latin America? He has only traveled once to G20 in Argentina. So I believe that his actions say a lot of how he believes that we need to look at our neighborhood. And our neighborhood is Latin America. Our neighborhood is the Western Hemisphere.
But President Trump may not have traveled so many times as Joe Biden to Latin America, but he does have a considerable percentage of their vote, doesn't he? I mean, this is what some Latino voters have been telling us about the Biden legacy.
I think the Biden campaign has to go on this massive apology tour with the community, because in the end, the campaign and the candidate has to admit that the relationship between the Latino community and the Obama-Biden administration wasn't so great in the end. I mean, Latinos didn't really recover from the recession as well as other groups. And then the deportation record of the Obama-Biden administration is still sort of this elephant in the room. And the Biden campaign almost wants to avoid that truth. And I think it's important for them to just go and meet with the community and begin to listen and promise to do better.
Hispanic voters know that they have a growing level of sway in this election, and they do not want to be taken for granted. They don't want empty promises. Can Biden deliver?
Yes, he can. And the reason is, one, we're not a monolithic community. What you were saying about President Trump, yes, President Trump has followers. President Trump has Latinos for Trump. And that's just a healthy society where we all have differences and we believe in different ideologies. I understand that. But in terms of Julio Varela, not only have we seen what the campaign is doing, but there are volunteers. There is now a group called Venezolanos con Biden that has already 200 Venezuelan leaders that are focused.
But beyond the slogans, yes. Evelyn, there are some Latino voters who truly believe and care about the policies, not just what Biden is able to say. And let's just take a listen to what he did say in his last debate with Bernie Sanders.
But I will send to the desk immediately a bill that requires for access to citizenship for 11 million undocumented folks, number one. Number two, in the first 100 days of my administration, no one will be deported at all. From that point on, the only deportations that will take place are commissions of felonies in the United States of America.
So Biden, they're clearly trying to win back those votes that have been lost because of this legacy. Is it a unifying issue, though, for Latinos across the board?
It's not our only issue, and they're not only targeting the immigration issue. I mean, we are currently in a pandemic where we have mostly our Black community and our Latino community being affected by a pandemic. And we have a president right now telling our communities to inject themselves with chemicals that might be lethal to them. So when we look at this as a Latino community, not just as me as a Democratic strategist, but as a Latino community, we see someone in Joe Biden that's not going to be telling us to inject ourselves with chemicals that are going to affect us. You know, not only is he saying to inject ourselves with this, but he has been injecting this nation for the last 5 years with hate, with saying that because we speak a different language, because we look differently, that we should not be accepted.
But his anti-immigration record and policies and statements don't seem to be hurting him that much with the community. According to the latest Pew research, he stands at 30%.
But he stands with a base of Latinos who are with him because they think exactly the same thing. But that does not mean that we all think the same thing. Why? Because let's say in Florida, we have a community, and if you look at the numbers in Florida, we have people, Latinos, who are citizens in rural areas that every day are being affected by the people who are speaking on behalf of Trump, who are telling them that they do not belong here. And that's something that Joe Biden does and is different, is that he sees us. He sees us and he believes that we are a nation of immigrants and that we belong in the fabric of this nation.
And how much of a generation gap is there among Latino voters? To what extent does this young, fast-growing demographic, every 30 seconds you apparently have a Latino person who turns 18 and is able to vote in the next election, how much do their votes differ from those of their parents and grandparents?
It is generational. You have here in Florida, where I am at, we have the Cuban American community where the older generation is more hardline on certain issues. We have the younger generation who actually wants to see a different change in Cuba. It is generational. There are some younger generation that are more conservative, but that's the beauty of a democracy, and that's how we need to maintain it in this nation. And that's why we're fighting so hard to have Joe Biden elected, because when you have a president that's saying that he's going to stay 9 to 13 years more in office, it's very scary.
Evelyn Perez-Verdia, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
According to the International Monetary Fund, the global economy could contract by $9 trillion over the next 2 years. Here in the United States, the pandemic could cost hundreds of billions of dollars in direct medical expenses alone. In March, Congress passed a $2 trillion emergency relief plan and is now considering a second round of aid. The financial burden, though, is leading a group of 29 House Democrats to call on the House Armed Services Committee to cut military spending to free up additional resources for the fight against the virus. The Trump administration has already secured an increase in its annual defense budget, which now stands at $740 billion for the year 2021. But can the pandemic force the U.S. Congress to reconsider its record-setting military spending. Let's put this issue in focus with Democratic Congresswoman representing Washington, D.C., Eleanor Holmes Norton. Congresswoman Norton, you are one of 29 House Democrats who've signed on to this letter asking for cuts in military spending. Can you convince, though, enough Democrats and Republicans to move towards your position on this?
If this were any other period, I would say it would be difficult. But this year, in light of the coronavirus, when we're asking for unheard amounts of money, we believe we have a chance to get other members to understand that 3 years running with increases during the Trump administration in the military budget amounting to 20% is time enough, particularly when we're in a period when there are not any conflicts, and in fact, when the rest of the world is suffering from the same conflict, coronavirus, as we are. So the need is, with funds, our very first priority, and perhaps our only priority, should be in funds to combat this virus.
But how much unity of purpose, though, is there, given the fact that this is an extraordinary time, a time of uncertainty, economic depravity, and a health crisis never seen before? You do not seem to have enough votes, though, enough support behind you when it comes to your own party. You're 233 Democrats in the House, and only 29 have signed on to this.
Oh, that's no indication of the kind of support we have. When you do a letter like this, you reach out to a number of members. You don't wait until you get your whole caucus. And remember, we control the House now to send a letter forward. I can guarantee you that we would probably have support even from more conservative Democrats. And remember, we took over the House because of more moderate Democrats. And when we're going 3 years in a row and in the middle of an emergency, it does seem to me we have a very good chance of getting support for a reduction. Sometimes we've had to say we'll do an equivalent amount for domestic spending and military spending. This year, we're going with the notion of below last year's budget for military spending at a time when we can't help but increase spending on domestic matters.
So below last year, and last year the Senate passed a bill with a defense spending budget of $738 billion. This year you want it to be less, yet lawmakers have already agreed with the administration to a top line of $740 billion. So can you really reverse course now? Can you really get the more hawkish members of the Congress to adopt your position again on this?
It may be too late only because of where we are in the appropriation year. But the further we get into the coronavirus crisis, the better our chances of convincing members, if you're going to save money anywhere, it's in the military budget where the need is clearly non-existent.
And you lay out your position in this letter. Let me quote an excerpt from it. You say, at some point, spending more than every other nation on earth must be enough. America needs a coronavirus cure, not more war. We need more testing, not more bombs. But many Republican lawmakers, as you know, and some Democrats, believe that what is needed is more money spent on national defense because they feel that there is a growing threat that needs to be countered, whether it is coming from the Chinese or the Russians. What do you say to their arguments?
I don't think you could find a single Republican saying this threat from the Chinese for anything except coronavirus where it started. I don't think they could name a single threat, but there is no district and no state in the United States that does not need more testing, contract tracing, and treatment. And as far as I'm concerned, the strongest need is for vaccine development. You can't do all of those things and continue to raise spending where no one could cite a need, and that is in the military.
A growing trend The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 nations in the world combined, and the gap continues to grow.
We believe that the defense budget has lots of support from my Republican colleagues and from President Trump. But the Democrats have introduced the HEROES Act with a $2.2 trillion budget or call for funding. And that, of course, is a bill that'll have a tough time getting through, but it's laid down a marker for where any new funds should go. It will be very hard to make the case this year, particularly with 100,000 cases throughout the world, that more money is needed, throughout the United States, that more money is needed in the defense budget and not for coronavirus.
All right, Congresswoman Norton, thank you very much for your time. Great to have you.
It was a pleasure.
Now, while the US makes up close to 5% of the global population, it accounts for nearly 25% of the world's prisoners, with 2.3 million people incarcerated in more than 3,000 prisons. According to the COVID Prison Project, more than 30,000 inmates have tested positive, with 150,000 tested and at least 440 COVID-related deaths reported. A recent American Civil Liberties Union model projects that US prisons could add 188,000 deaths to the country's total without adequate social distancing measures. Today, the state of Ohio has the most COVID-19 cases in US prisons, with 73% of inmates infected. In Texas, 70% of prisoners who've been tested are infected. We spoke with members of the Texas Inmate Families Association. Here's what they told us.
The unit my son is in on April 16th had 10 positive cases of coronavirus. The very next day, April 17th, they had 65 positive, and it was due to a transfer from the Beto unit, and TDCJ did not notify CDC nor Brazoria County of the incoming transfers. What this did is it took them to a complete lockdown situation where they no longer had any freedom to go into the day room. They are in their cells 24/7. They get to come out every 2 or 3 days to shower.
Their facility, their pod, has an area with tables and chairs and a TV. And there's 28 men in this pod. There's not a lot of area in there. So you really can't quote unquote social distance at all, because you're always pretty much within 3 feet of somebody else, not 6 feet. And they were given masks after a couple of weeks. And it's kind of like closing the barn door after the horse has already left.
My husband is currently incarcerated with TDCJ here in Texas and is currently tested positive for COVID-19 and been transferred to a UTMB TDCJ hospital. I believe he's contracted the COVID-19 due to employees, whether it be staff or offenders, coming in after being out and not being given the proper personal protective equipment for the offenders and for the staff there.
And so now, with prisons becoming major hotspots for COVID-19 outbreaks, lawsuits are being filed on behalf of inmates citing inhumane conditions. And despite the Attorney General's directive in late March instructing the Federal Bureau of Prisons to prioritize early release or home confinement to stop the spread of the virus, the Trump administration is now asking the Supreme Court to halt the release of inmates at risk of COVID-19. Let's take an in-depth look with Marc Mauer, the Executive Director of the Sentencing Project, a group that advocates for criminal justice reform in the U.S. Mr. Mauer, how would you describe the situation in federal prisons and local prisons across the United States when it comes to the risks that inmates face? Is decisive action being taken to stop the spread of COVID-19 among inmates? Because there was a directive just last March issued by the Attorney General suggesting that some prisoners should be released to home confinement at the very least.
Yeah. Well, if we look at the level of local jails around the country where most people are held on pretrial detainment because they can't meet cash bail, A good number of jurisdictions have taken significant actions there. Some have reduced their populations as much as 50%. After all, these are people who have not been convicted, they're waiting trial, and they're in prison, they're in jail because they're poor, they can't make bail. So that's been encouraging. At the state and federal level, the number of people released to make room for social distancing and the like is very modest all around. Some state systems have released a few thousand people, even though they have tens of thousands in their system. At the federal level, it's exceedingly modest, the number of people released to home confinement. Depending on which numbers you think are most accurate, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 may have been released in that status, but there's 170,000 people in the system overall, and that's the challenge.
But is there enough consistency, though, in the way the rules are being applied? Because there is a basic criteria, isn't there, for prisoners who can be released early. They must have at least served 50% of their sentence or 25% with less than 18 months remaining. Is this being applied consistently?
No, it's not. And that was the memorandum from the Attorney General, and they've gone back and forth on that, on whether you had to serve a certain percentage of your sentence. The criteria themselves, I think, are very flawed. You know, we should be looking at first at people who are elderly and or infirm. Even if they haven't served 50% of their sentence, their risk of getting the virus and dying from it is enormous in so many cases, and they would not be a threat to public safety to release a 65-year-old who already has respiratory issues and the like. So it's been applied very inconsistently, but perhaps more significantly, the policy itself is very narrowly drawn right now and won't reach many of the people who are really in dire circumstances.
Are there striking double standards at play? Because just recently, Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, was released, having served far less than the 50% of his jail time, which was over 7 years.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with people like Paul Manafort being released. He's in an age high-risk group, and he's got significant health issues. But at the same time, for every Manafort who's released, we should be looking at 100 other people who are in similar category to him, making sure they're getting the same consideration for release that he received.
What about the vast racial disparities that we see across prisons in the United States? If we take the case of Ohio alone, and Ohio is the state with the highest COVID-19 cases among inmates, there Black people are incarcerated at a rate 5 times higher than white people. Is that a reflection of the national landscape as well?
Very much so. Nationally, that's about the right ratio, about 5 Black prisoners, the rate 5 times that of whites. There are many reasons for that: racism in society, how socioeconomics, race and class overlap, and the like. Nonetheless, it's a very distressing situation. It means that just as isn't true in the larger community in prison, people of color are very disproportionately affected by the virus itself. And all those disparities just play out in very serious ways today as well.
And just looking at the recent trends and the fact that the United States has by far the largest per capita prison population in the world, do you see the pandemic changing this trend?
I would hope that we might learn some lessons from this, lessons we should have learned long ago, but maybe belatedly. So for a start, as I mentioned, why are we keeping people in jails before trial? Because they don't have money to pay a bail bondsman when wealthy people can gain their release before trial. We also lead the world in incarceration, both because we send more people to prison and keep them there for longer periods of time than most other nations. So we could learn from this as well that there's very little public safety benefit. Why don't we cut down on that? Why don't we rethink our commitment to mass incarceration?
Marc Mauer, Executive Director of the Sentencing Project, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And so there is no doubt the 2020 election will be decided by the politics of a lethal virus. That is the obvious. How both camps will capitalize on COVID-19 is less so. Democrats are still struggling to find a unifying message a message above and beyond turning this election into an anti-Trump referendum. And they still cannot seem to galvanize voters, critically minority voters, nor have they been able to close ranks or capitalize on the administration's disastrous response to the pandemic and its economic fallout. Now, Trump, on the other hand, is hammering his simple, simplistic messages, telling voters, we've done a great job, even as the death toll surpasses 100,000. Because COVID-19 could have killed up to 2 million Americans, the president says, and the economy, he promises, will be stronger than ever before. And so, in short, electoral politics is about messaging. Whatever your message, if repeated with force, with conviction, with consistency, that message will sink in, and your supporters will cast their ballots. Whether your message is true or false, if it gives hope, if it's upbeat, that slogan will get you votes, especially in times of adversity. That is what Trump knows and what the Democrats fear. Let us know what you think at _Inside America. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and the entire team here in Washington, thanks for watching.